Hi, Jay here. The following story unfolds through an online message board, a little like Reddit, where strangers gather to share their darkest, most unnerving experiences. This particular post, "Someone's on my balcony," details a first-hand account of a terrifying late-night encounter. I thought it would sound better if it was read in that message board style, so I'll read each entry, beginning with the original poster's disturbing experience, followed by the responses from others on the thread. Original poster. This just happened last night. It was around 1:30 in the morning, and I was drifting off when my 6th grade son came into our bedroom, visibly shaken. He leaned over and whispered, "Dad, someone's out there on the balcony." I thought maybe he was sleepwalking, but he was adamant. He said he heard footsteps right outside his room, pacing back and forth on the deck, which should have been impossible. We locked the glass doors and drawn the shutters before going to bed. No one should be able to get out there. The balcony runs between our son's room and our bedroom, so my husband and I went over and pressed our ears against the glass, and then we heard it too. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was calmly strolling along just a few feet away. It wasn't a stray animal or the wind. These were heavy and intentional footsteps. Someone was out there for sure. Reply. Whoa, that is absolutely terrifying. So it wasn't a ghost or anything? It's one thing to think that there might be a spirit lingering outside, but knowing it could be a real person, that's way worse. Random strangers who climb onto balconies aren't just passing by. They're there for a reason. And if they're there for a reason in the middle of the night, you're lucky you kept the shutters shut. I hope you reported it to the police and to your neighbors too. Something like that could be really dangerous if it happened again. The original poster replies, "Our daughter, a little older than her brother, was asleep in her room, so we woke her up and brought her into our bedroom. As I grabbed my phone to call the police, our son suddenly froze and hissed, 'They're talking!' Every single one of us pressed our ears against the glass to try and make out any words being said. My skin prickled as I realized it was a woman's voice. It was very soft, but she was clearly whispering, or at least mumbling, 'Goodbye.' Our daughter let out a scream, and my whole body went numb. I could barely hold it together to call the police, but I did, and when they finally arrived, they searched the property, but whoever was out there had already vanished into the night. The officer assured us that they'd keep an eye out around the neighborhood, but honestly, that did little to ease our fears. As crazy as it sounds, I started to wonder if maybe my husband had been keeping secrets, a lover turned stalker perhaps. When I confronted him, he was furious. He said he'd never cheat. He even offered me to have a look through his phone. And honestly, I believed him before he made that gesture. But I'm left feeling no closer to understanding what happened out there. Reply. Oh my god, this is like something out of a nightmare. Just the thought that there was someone out there. I can't tell what's scarier, if it was a real person or something else entirely. The way your son picked up on the voice and everything. I got chills. Total horror movie stuff. Reply. Good grief, I would have lost it. Since you called the police, they must have thought it was real too. And that goodbye thing? It almost makes it sound like someone was letting you know that they had come and gone. Creepy as it is, maybe they were after someone else, got mixed up and found the wrong house. So after the goodbye, what happened next? The original poster replies, After that, things just went haywire. My daughter was bawling, my son was practically glued to my side, and none of us saw how or where the woman left. The officers searched the balcony and the surrounding area, but it was like she disappeared without a trace. The officers didn't document any footprints or fingerprints though. I would have preferred it if they did. The reason being is because the officers suggested it could have been a prank. Maybe one of our kids' friends, but that voice was way too mature, and I believe our kids don't know anyone who'd pull something this extreme. Reply. In horror movies, checking outside is usually the last thing you'd want to do. Who knows if it was just one person, or if there could have been two of them out there. If your husband stepped out, he might have been ambushed. What a terrifying thing to go through. And if it were some stranger, then not opening the door probably saved you all from something even worse. The original poster replies, "So here's an update. After the incident, we've taken all the security measures we can think of. My husband's brother loaned us his dog for a little while, but ironically, it hasn't barked once since arriving here. When that woman was out there, I didn't dare crack the shutters open, even a sliver. The idea of peeking, only to see someone inches away the other side, was just no. And letting my husband go out there alone, not a chance. Like you, I imagined him getting ambushed. And my only thought was keeping the kids safe. For now, we're all sleeping on the first floor, crammed into the living room. Hey, I'd rather be safe than sorry. And we still don't know if it was supernatural or not. I'm just glad we locked ourselves in." Reply: "Honestly, I don't think it's an affair or anything. That kind of thing would have probably shown up by now. It's probably just some random person with issues, which is terrifying but slightly better than the alternative. If it was a serious criminal or something more sinister, things could have ended way worse. You did the right thing by not opening the shutters." Reply: "Set up a motion sensor light, maybe. Though I've heard that even paranormal things can trip those. Either way, something needs to be out there to scare people off if they try it again." There were no further posts or replies. I just hope that whatever was out there didn't come back. This is a strange tale tied to a local legend that comes from a certain region in Japan. In the northeastern part of Japan, near the Pacific Ocean, there's something called Yamase. It's a type of weather pattern that's specific to this area. During the summer, a cold and damp air mass from the Pacific Ocean drifts inland. When this Yamase rolls in, it hits the mountains, gets cooled down, and then turns into this thick, dense fog that blankets the area. Now, when I was growing up, I was always told, if the Yamase comes in, run. Don't let it swallow you. The reason? Because when you're inside that fog, the line between this world and the next gets blurred. They say that if you're caught in it, you might just hear voices from the other side, the world of the dead. People in that region really fear it. They go out of their way to avoid getting caught in the Yamase. And honestly, after hearing some of the stories, I get why. I've actually heard from a few different people who got swallowed up by the Yamase, and their stories are all pretty similar, but also pretty creepy. One person told me about hearing the murmur of many voices, like a crowd of people all talking at once, but he couldn't make out any of the words. Another said they heard someone crying and screaming out people's names. The eeriest one, for me personally, was from someone who swore they heard the sound of people partying, laughter, chattering, and even the clinking of glasses, like they were at some kind of feast. When the Yamase engulfs you, it's like you've got one foot in the afterlife. That's what they believe anyway. And considering the fog gets so thick that you can't even see your hand if you stretch it out in front of you, well, I guess it makes sense that strange things might happen. Imagine that for a second. You're out there in the mountains, and suddenly the world goes silent, the air goes cold, and this heavy fog just swallows everything. You can't see more than a foot in front of you, and then, out of nowhere, you start hearing voices that shouldn't be there. It's no wonder the people in the region are so wary of the Yamase. So if you ever find yourself in Japan, and you're up in the mountains in that part of Japan during the summer, and you see that thick fog rolling in, do yourself a favor. Get out of there. You never know what you might hear, or who might be trying to reach out from the other side. I work a job that requires me to stay on the move, checking in with my team over the radio as we handle various assignments. Normally the radio is just a tool, a way to stay connected, but recently it became a source of something far stranger than I'd ever expected. Just a few days ago, I was using the radio like I always do, exchanging updates and casual chatter with my coworkers. Out of nowhere, my radio began to act up. It was only mine. None of the others had any issues. At first I heard bursts of static, harsh and loud, and crackling interruptions that came and went. It was so frustrating that I switched channels, thinking that would solve it, but the noises just kept coming. There was this relentless hum, almost like there was some interference that wouldn't clear. I tried adjusting the volume and moving slightly to get a better connection, but the interference remained. There was nothing I could do but endure it. And I remember thinking, why my radio? I couldn't leave my post, so I just gritted my teeth and waited it out, hoping that it would stop. I was getting pretty annoyed about it, until suddenly the interference cut out completely. For a second, there was total silence, like the air itself paused. Then, breaking that quiet, came something that caught me completely off guard. The unmistakable sound of a child screaming. It was a desperate cry, a voice so raw with panic that it sent chills down my spine. The voice was calling out, "Mom, Mom, it's hot, I can't breathe, there's a fire, please." The words were clear, each one of them carrying an overwhelming sense of fear and urgency. I stood there frozen as this child's voice boomed through my radio. It was so vivid that I half expected to turn around and see someone in distress nearby. At first I thought it had to be someone's television, or maybe a dramatic scene from a movie. But even that thought didn't sit well. It was the middle of the day. How likely was it that someone would be blasting a show with cries like that for everyone to hear in the neighborhood? Still, I tried to rationalize, thinking, well, maybe hoping is a better word, that it was just a nearby TV. But the cries went on and on. I kept listening, but very aware that I was unable to help. The voice just kept piercing through the silence. My stomach knotted. The cries had a desperate quality to them that I couldn't shake off. I turned the volume down to test if it was really coming from my radio, but when I turned it back up, the cries persisted, clear as ever. It was coming from my radio. I began to wonder if it could be a prank, but that didn't make much sense either. Who would go to these lengths to interfere with a radio on a random weekday afternoon, and why? Plus, kids messing around with radios in this day and age? It's a pretty outdated idea if you ask me. Growing more uneasy, I reached out to a coworker stationed nearby. "Hey," I asked, "are you hearing any strange noises like a child yelling?" They paused for a second and then replied, "No, nothing here." I let out a shaky breath. I was hoping I was just imagining things, but my coworker came over to check on me. As he approached, his expression changed. "Wait, now I hear it. Is that coming from your radio?" His eyes widened in disbelief as he listened to the same cries that I had been hearing. To make things even weirder, my coworker's radio was silent. No issues, no interference, just normal radio chatter. At that point, I'd had enough. It made no sense. We were all on the same channel at work, so why was the voice only coming through my radio? Frustrated, I switched off my radio, trying to block out those awful cries. But even though the radio was off, I could still faintly hear the sobs. They were softer, like they were fading. But they lingered for what felt like another 15 minutes. I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. It sounded like they were coming from nowhere, like the air itself. My skin prickled as each helpless sob grew weaker, until finally, they died out completely. The whole experience rattled me. That night I checked the news. looking for any reports of fires or accidents that might explain what I'd heard, but there was nothing. For a brief moment, I felt strange relief. Maybe it had all been my imagination, some bizarre trick of my mind. I started to worry about myself a little, but then I remembered that my coworker heard it too. I just couldn't figure it out. But exactly 1 week later, my sense of relief was shattered. I heard on the news that a fire had broken out in an apartment complex just near the area where I had first heard those cries. A young child had tragically lost their life in the blaze. My heart sank as I made the connection, and a shiver ran through me. That cry I heard. Was it a warning? A premonition? Since then, this disturbing phenomena hasn't stopped. 4 more times now I've heard voices break through on my radio, each one carrying the same frantic desperation. 3 times it's been cries for help after accidents. Another time it was the chilling screams of someone trapped in what sounded like another fire. But here's the most unsettling part. After that first instance, these voices seemed to be coming from not the future, but from past events that had already happened. I researched them. It was as if my radio was picking up ghostly echoes from the past. Every time it happens, it's only my radio. No one else picks up on these sounds, and I can't shake the fear that somehow my radio is a conduit for something beyond my understanding. I realize how crazy I must sound to you. So now I guess you understand why I've remained anonymous. At first I thought maybe I was just losing it, hearing things that weren't there. But every time someone else is around, they hear it too. Today was no different. My coworker and I were standing by when the radio crackled to life, and we both heard it. Clear as day. "Someone call the police, there's been a stabbing." That final cry left me on edge, unsettled in a way I can't even put in words. I don't know what's going on with the radio, but each new voice terrifies me. Part of me wants to stop using it altogether. But another part of me is morbidly fascinated, waiting to hear what's next, and fearing it all the same. This story happened when I was at university. I was a student, living alone in a small, aging apartment complex. Some units were rented out as student dorms, creating an odd atmosphere. There was a mixture of tenants, some young and some much older. The building had an eerie atmosphere, even from the outside. It had chipped paint, and inside there was creaky staircases. It was old. My room was on the first floor, and a friend of mine from the same major lived on the floor above me. My room was a typical single unit, a 6 tatami room with wooden floors and basic furnishings. What stood out the most about the place were these unusual painted doors. They were all green. All the apartments had these identical green doors, as if the building itself was trying hard to create some kind of cohesive look. However, my friend's door was different. His room had recently been renovated. Unlike the rest of the building, which had a traditional tatami floor, he had a wooden floor. He was thrilled with the unique look, and I remember him eagerly moving his things in, full of excitement about his new, unique living space. At first, my friend loved his apartment. I would often visit, and we would spend hours hanging out, talking, playing games. He was your typical happy-go-lucky type, the kind of person who filled the room with energy. But a few months in, I noticed a change in him. The spark in his eyes seemed dim, and he rarely smiled. At first I thought it was just the stress of university life getting to him. But the change went deeper. He began to avoid his own apartment, often lingering in the common areas or finding excuses to hang out in my room instead. I asked him about it one evening. Hesitating at first, he finally shared a strange, recurring dream he'd been having. He described how each night he found himself in a dark, overgrown forest. The air was thick, and the silence oppressive. As he wandered, he would eventually stumble upon a door standing alone among the trees. Curiously, he'd open the door, and just as quickly he'd wake up, startled. He said he felt a strange, heavy unease after each dream, but initially he brushed it off as a random nightmare. But then, night after night, the dream persisted, slowly evolving. The door began leading to increasingly familiar locations. At first he saw a childhood playground, then his elementary school, each time opening the door to different places from his past. Recently the dream had changed again, and the door started leading him back to the present, to the very building we lived in. Each night he grew closer, and now he feared that soon he'd open the door and find himself in his own room. He confessed that with every iteration of the dream, he felt a gnawing sense of dread, a profound certainty that he must not open that final door to his dorm. He wasn't sure what might happen if he did, but the thought alone terrified him. His waking life too had taken on a strange, almost haunted quality. He began noticing subtle things around his room that shouldn't have been there. The faint smell of perfume would waft into his apartment at odd hours, even though he didn't use any cologne or scented products. Sometimes he'd find long dark strands of hair scattered on the floor. He swore he hadn't let anyone in with long hair, let alone dark hair. These experiences weighed heavily on him, adding to the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. Seeing his unease, I suggested that he take a break and head back to his family's home for the upcoming summer break. A few days later he left, seemingly relieved to escape for a while. Since I was working a part-time job, I couldn't leave. I remained in the dorm alone. During his absence, I met up with an older alum who had graduated a few years back. Over drinks, our conversation turned towards campus life, and out of nowhere, he asked, "So, is that room still there, in the dorm?" At first, I didn't understand what he meant. When I asked, he looked uncomfortable and said he was referring to the very apartment my friend was renting. He must have seen the confusion on my face because he quickly tried to dismiss the topic, but something about his expression made me press him. Finally, after a long pause, he admitted that there was a rumor that someone had died in that apartment. He didn't know the details, whether it was an accident, illness, or something more sinister, only that that room carried a dark history. Finding that out left me feeling uneasy, especially after all that stuff my friend told me. A few nights later, an unsettling experience of my own occurred. It was a hot, humid night, and usually my calm dog began barking furiously at the door. I checked the clock. It was around 11 p.m. Well past the hour for any friendly visitor. As I looked towards the door, the overhead light flickered twice before going out. My heart raced. I tried to shake the growing sense of dread, pulling my dog close to me and lying down, hoping to will myself to sleep. But that's when I heard it. A distant click-clack, click-clack sound, echoing from the hallway. The unmistakable rhythm of high heels seemed to be reverberating through the building. The footsteps grew louder, approaching my door, and then paused. I held my breath, every nerve on edge. The sound resumed, pacing back and forth in front of my apartment, as if whoever was out there had no intention of leaving. Sweat trickled down my neck, and I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for it to stop. The idea of bolting out of my bed and running to the balcony crossed my mind, but fear rooted me in place. My dog even cowered beside me, silent yet tense, clearly sensing something was off. Hours passed in a tense haze, and eventually dawn arrived, flooding the room with light. I was safe, but the memory of those footsteps haunted me. Later that day, I told my friend about everything, including the eerie footsteps and the alum story. He listened quietly, a grave expression settling over his face. I urged him to consider moving out, and he agreed. In the end, though, he left school altogether, within months, disappearing back to his family's home without a word of goodbye. I never saw him again, and I still don't know if the nightmares, strange occurrences, and these rumors of the room's dark past were connected. But even now, the haunting memory of those high-heeled footsteps echoes through my mind, a sound forever etched in my memory, taunting me with questions that I guess will never be answered. This is a story from last year, just after my first child was born. The experience still lingers in my mind, vivid and chilling. I had given birth at a hospital that followed a mother-baby separation policy, where babies stayed in the newborn room and mothers rested in their rooms until they were needed. My bed was in a shared ward, close to the door, and I was part of a 6-person room. Unlike other hospitals, there was no strict schedule for feeding. Instead, they would call us over to the newborn room whenever our baby cried. During the day, the nurses would even come in person to gently let us know, but at night, a small speaker near our beds would buzz with our baby's cry if we were needed. On my 4th night after the birth, as exhaustion wrapped around me, I drifted in and out of sleep. A strange, restless feeling took hold of me, and every time I closed my eyes, I would jolt awake again. It was as if something was keeping me half awake, whispering to my senses that rest would be impossible that night. I'm guessing any mother can relate. Then, amid my shallow sleep, I felt a light tap, a gentle but unmistakable touch, as if someone was trying to rouse me. I opened my eyes and saw a figure dressed in white standing beside my bed. The figure seemed calm, almost serene, and it leaned down slightly, meeting my eyes. "Please, come with me," it said in a soft, kind voice. Still groggy, I assumed it was a nurse coming to let me know that my baby needed me. "Oh yeah, I'll be right there," I mumbled, still half asleep, and quickly got out of bed, heading down the silent halls to the newborn room. When I arrived, the only nurse there looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Oh, Miss Kanda, is everything okay?" she asked. That's not my real name, by the way. I explained that another nurse had come to call me, letting her know I'd been awakened and I thought my baby was crying. But the nurse's expression shifted to confusion, then to something like caution. "No one came to call you. I haven't left the newborn room, and I'm the only nurse on duty in this ward tonight," she said, her brow furrowed. Confused, I replied, "But I'm sure I felt someone tap me awake. They even asked me to come, so I assumed." The nurse's face grew serious. "If we need a mother, we use the speaker system at night. Leaving the newborns alone isn't possible. None of the other staff were assigned here tonight either." She smiled sympathetically, though a hint of discomfort still lingered in her gaze. "You've been through a lot. It's normal to feel on edge. Try to relax and get some rest. We'll call you if your baby needs you." Before returning to my room, I asked to check on my little one, and I saw him fast asleep, not a tear or a whimper in sight. I climbed back into my bed, feeling unsettled, yet grateful my child was peaceful. But as I lay there, the memory of the figure became even clearer in my mind. I was certain the touch had been real. The voice still echoed in my memory, soft, calming, yet somehow distant. In the nurse's expression, there had been something almost knowing, as if she had heard similar accounts before. Perhaps others had seen this same visitor dressed in white, lingering in the dark hours, to call them softly, gently, as if on a mission all its own. The strange figure's visit left me rattled, but I thought back on all the stories I'd heard, tales of heightened intuition, of odd unseen presences that sometimes appear around those on the cusp of life and death. They say new mothers, especially right after birth, sometimes experience a kind of hyper-awareness, as if they can see or sense things beyond the ordinary. Now I wonder, was that white figure just a figment of my exhausted mind? Or had it come with a purpose that I would never understand? The touch had been too gentle to forget, the words too clear to brush off. And as I replayed it in my mind, I realized that in my rush to go to my child, I hadn't noticed whether the figure had left the room. My bed was near the door, and I should have seen it exit, but I hadn't. I shivered under the hospital sheets, feeling a chill despite the warmth. It was as if, even now, that gentle presence was hovering nearby, watching over me from the threshold. I'm thankful for the help that night, and for the quiet in my baby's sleep, but even now, the memory comes to me from time to time. A soft call in the night, and the touch of a hand from an unseen visitor in white. This is a story that was told to me by my mother when I visited home during Golden Week. She grew up in Akita Prefecture, and in her younger days she'd been part of a rough, fearless crowd, the kind who'd spend late nights sneaking around abandoned places. They were obsessed with superstition and thrill-seeking. It was more than 30 years ago now, but the details still make me shiver. One night, she and a group of her friends decided to test their nerves at an infamous haunted spot, an abandoned town left to decay. They arrived in the middle of nowhere after midnight, the dead of night wrapping around them in a thick silence. The town was like a snapshot of an apocalypse, buildings sitting untouched and silent, stores with doors half open, and the cinema seemed frozen in time. It was as if everyone had simply vanished, leaving only the shells of their lives behind. The group wasn't easily scared. They treated the trip like a game, taking turns, daring one another to venture further into the forgotten town. They'd drive their car a little way, stop when something caught their attention, laugh, shout, and then press on. As they moved deeper into the desolate areas, the air grew thick with echoes. Their voices bounced eerily off the walls, repeating back to them in a way that felt unnatural, as though these echoes were something more than mere sound. The abandoned buildings had a haunting reputation. It was said that if you shouted loud enough, the voices of the dead would answer you back. They tried it, yelling as loudly as they could, but only their voices' echoes returned. Still, they joked, pointing to dark windows and open doors, saying things like, "I just saw something move up there," and then laughing nervously. I guess that kind of could be fun in the dark, but I would be freaking out if it was me. Their destination, however, wasn't just the ruins. They were aiming to reach an old, half-hidden hot spring further in, a known spot by locals for another disturbing rumor. Inside, on one of the walls, there was supposed to be a stain, a black stain in the shape of a woman's figure. It was supposed to be really creepy, so of course they all wanted to see it, especially since they came all that way. Few dared to venture all the way to the hot spring, but among my mother's friends, simply visiting wasn't enough. They brought bathing supplies with the intent to see that stain for themselves and maybe even take a dip. There was a sort of strange hierarchy among thrill-seekers. Seeing the stain was brave, but those who dared to actually bathe there were practically legends. It wasn't anything like they expected. It wasn't too much to look at. The building itself was just a decrepit shack, barely held together, its sliding door broken and propped up beside the entrance. Inside, a rusted bucket dangled from the ceiling next to a dim, flickering bulb. The air smelled of mold and stagnant water. Inside, there was a small, murky bathing area, large enough for only a few people. Sure enough, on the concrete wall above the bath was the strange stain, a vague, shadowy shape that almost, but not quite, looked like a woman stood there. They stared at it, the odd lines seeming to form shoulders and a head. It didn't look like anything they'd seen before, but it wasn't exactly human either. They nervously laughed it off, nudging each other, saying things like, "Who's scared now? This is nothing," as they laughed and dared each other to get into the water, eventually relaxing, as they took turns bathing, laughing about how ridiculous it all was. Soon they were dressing, gathering their things to head back, when one of them realized she'd left a bottle of shampoo near the edge of the bath. It was expensive, so she wanted to go back and retrieve it. She went back, but she froze as she looked up at the wall. The stain had changed. It was still there, but it had shifted somehow. It wasn't just an odd shape anymore. It was leaning, reaching. She shouted for the others, and when they joined her, they too fell silent, staring. The shape had twisted subtly, but undeniably. It was like it was watching them. Their earlier bravado was gone, and a cold dread settled over the group. Quietly, they gathered their things, the hot spring feeling far too cramped, the air thick with something unsettling. No one spoke as they left, their footsteps quick and sharp and echoing. As they passed through the town on their way out, a voice echoed through the dark, loud enough to cut through the silence. They froze, exchanging terrifying glances. "Did you hear that?" the driver whispered, slowing the car. At first, they thought it must be someone else exploring the ruins, but the town had been empty, dead silent. One of the girls, her voice tight with fear, broke in. "I'm really hungry, can we just go?" Usually someone would have laughed or teased her, but not this time. No one spoke as they sped away from the ruins. The laughter, the jokes, everything had been left back there in that dark, abandoned place. They didn't stop until they reached one of their homes, where they collapsed, relief flooding over them. As they began to relax, they found that they were once again able to laugh, the tension finally breaking. But as they talked about the night, the conversation shifted back to the voice they heard behind them. One of them hesitated, then looked up, her voice soft but trembling. "Didn't you notice? That last voice we heard, it didn't echo back like our voices did. We were yelling the whole time and it always echoed, but that last one, there was nothing, just silence." The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. Was something else with them that night?